Welcome to another online program from the Adams County Historical Society. My name is Antigone Ladd, and I'm delighted to host this program. I serve here as a board member, as well as a person who has researched for many years in their vast collection of items in World Wars I and II. The Society has an amazing collection, over 1 million artifacts, photographs, and documents, which we are working hard to preserve and to move to our new home. We have begun a capital campaign to preserve those artifacts and to open a museum and education center with a huge research facility. If you care to continue our programs and to help us build our new museum and education center, we would welcome your donation of any size. It's very easy to do it online. There's a button at the bottom of your screen that makes it safe and secure. So thank you for being part of our audience, and we hope you enjoy the programs. We plan to continue them for a great long period of time because we're getting lots of requests. We welcome your suggestions. If you have ideas on topics you'd like to see explored, give us a name, give us a topic, and we will go for it. Tonight's speaker will certainly be someone you have heard of and perhaps read or seen in person for his many presentations. Jared Frederick is a historian and a history instructor at Penn State, Altoona. He has written extensively on the Civil War and on World War II. I find out tonight he has also made many videos, which I've enjoyed watching, and his students are certainly enlivened in their classes because Jared, forced to go to online programming this year, as many colleges did, and as the rest of us did as well, decided to teach some of his classes in period attire. He is a lively speaker. He is a master storyteller. And now I know from looking at his website, he's also an artist. So tonight's presentation will be a little different. Jared will talk about the history not of the Battle of Gettysburg, but of the battlefield itself. How has the battlefield changed since the 1950s? What uses have people made of the battlefield? He will share the stories of the changes in the battlefield through photographs and stories from the book that he has produced on the same subject. So I'm going to turn it over to Jared Frederick to give you a new perspective on the Gettysburg National Military Park.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jared Frederick. I'm an instructor of history at Penn State, Altoona. And for 5 of the best summers of my life, I was a seasonal park ranger at Gettysburg National Military Park. A few years after I departed the National Park Service, I wrote a book which is entitled Images of Modern America, Gettysburg National Military Park. And that's what I'm here to talk with you about this evening. I've entitled my presentation For the People, a Visual History of Gettysburg since the 1950s. And in this context, my book is very different from most Gettysburg books in the fact that it does not really talk about the 19th century or 1863 at all. Rather, it talks about the 1950s onward. And that is to say, this very vigorous time in Gettysburg's tourism history, where both the park, the town, and the nation as a whole was going through this vast revival in historical interest, blended with the birth of the family vacation thanks to a burgeoning automobile industry. And therefore, I thought this photograph here would be a perfect one to start off with. This was a commemorative ceremony marking the 100th anniversary of the Western Maryland Railroad in 1952, and it culminated in a partial recreation of Lincoln's journey to Gettysburg. And of course, the grand finale of that was a reenactment of the Gettysburg Address within the Soldiers' National Cemetery. And to me, this just evoked a lot of the Cold War era pageantry that was associated with American history and really underscored why a lot of Americans were coming to visit Gettysburg in the first place in the 1950s. And of course, perhaps among the most famous people to visit Gettysburg in the 1950s were people who were coming to pay homage or tribute or to reminisce with Gettysburg's most famous neighbor, and that was President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who in 1950 purchased a farmstead on the southwestern edge of the battlefield, and for the next several years, that home served as his summer White House, a place of recuperation and a means for him to get away from the hustle and bustle of Washington, D.C. He was not necessarily able to escape some of this heartache, though, in May of 1957, when his friend, ally, and sometime nemesis, Bernard Law Montgomery, came to visit him at Gettysburg. And here, too, as was often the case with diplomats who visited the farm, is that Eisenhower took Monty on a battlefield tour. And we can see them here perched on one of the many boulders that can be found on Little Round Top here on May 12th, 1957. And this was an excursion that garnered Eisenhower a little bit more frustration than what he was hoping for, because Montgomery critiqued both Generals Lee and Meade for their performances at Gettysburg. And, to critique, the sacrosanct Robert E. Lee, in the 1950s was considered blasphemy in the eyes of many Americans. And so Eisenhower and his staff had to put out a small public relations firestorm as a result of this visit. And of course, one of the other politicians who visited Gettysburg during this same era was, of course, Dwight Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon, whose great-grandfather, George Nixon of the 73rd Ohio Infantry, was actually mortally wounded at the Battle of Gettysburg, right below the slopes of Cemetery Hill. And so what we see here in this July 5th, 1953 photo is a young Richard Nixon paying tribute to his great-grandfather, who was mortally wounded only a few dozen yards away from where this photograph was taken. And I think this photograph really speaks to a lot of the familial connections that people forged in regard to their relationship with the Battle of Gettysburg as it fit within the context of the American story. And surely Richard Nixon was one such individual who tried to evoke and connect with that sense of heritage. It's during this same era where the National Park Service, which had been the administrator of this national park since the mid-1930s, begins to rework the way that it engaged with visitors. And one of the key individuals who was involved in this process over the course of 35 years was a park ranger by the name of Fred Tillberg, who we can see here giving a tour to a Soviet delegation in May of 1961. In some ways, Tillberg can be considered the godfather of the battlefield programming and tours and educational experiences that many visitors continue to enjoy today. But on top of that, too, we can also see from this photograph that the battlefield could fit within the context of Cold War politics and diplomacy. That if a foreign delegation was going to be coming to America to experience American culture or the way of life or the American story, then there was perhaps no finer place than Gettysburg to take them. And that is exactly what we see in this image. The following year after that photograph was taken, the National Park Service gets itself a brand new visitor center. Prior to that, it was located in very humble facilities on the second floor of the Gettysburg Post Office on Baltimore Street, which is now the public library. But in 1962, fitting within the broader mission of what was called Mission 66, the Cyclorama Center, as it would become known, was ultimately constructed. Now, Mission 66 was a nationwide effort to mark the 50th anniversary of the National Park Service. And not only did it mark the semi-centennial of that institution, but it was also meant to coincide with the oldest of the baby boomer generation who would be starting families on their own, and therefore tourism would be accelerating and visitation would be spiking at these various locations as a result. And so the Cyclorama Center really became a product of its time and of its culture. And the massive Gettysburg cyclorama painted by Paul Philip Pitot in the 1880s underwent a pretty substantial restoration at that time to be hung in this building. The conservators were using the best knowledge that they had at the time, but in short, this building was never well suited to accommodate this mammoth painting, and it would be well over another half a century until this was brought back to its former glory as it was initially enjoyed in the 1880s. But here we can see some typical tourist families being greeted by park staff in what was known as the drum within the Cyclorama Center where the painting was housed. Taken the same year as the previous picture, here is a photograph of John F. Kennedy, his wife Jackie, and members and family members of Kennedy's staff during his visit to the park in March of 1963. And the gentleman with his back to the camera is a very well-known battlefield guide by the name of Colonel Jacob Sheeds, who was a local history teacher, and he was thought the person to be best equipped to give the Kennedys a tour. And here we can see the Kennedys on the crest of Little Round Top on that March day. And Kennedy had a very unique relationship with the American Civil War. He was definitely a student of the nation's bloodiest conflict. During his visit to Ireland, during his administration, he gifted the regimental battle flag of one of the Irish Brigade regiments to the nation of Ireland that still has it in its possessions to this very day. And of course, one of the great bits of lore about Kennedy's March 1963 visit is his affinity for the Eternal Peace Light Memorial, which it has been argued becomes the inspiration for his own eternal flame that flickers still at Arlington National Cemetery. And so the cultural effects and byproducts of Gettysburg, its stories and its monuments are very far-reaching in these sorts of regards. 2 months later, Vice President Lyndon Johnson visits the Gettysburg Soldiers National Cemetery. And he does so with his daughter Lucy at his side. And in my view, he delivers one of the most poignant of political speeches that is ever rendered at the Gettysburg battlefield. And in essence, what he argues is that, he said a century ago, African Americans were freed from the bondages of slavery, but here we are a century later, and they are still not freed from the oppression that is dealt them due solely to the color of their skin. And in the 1960s, Gettysburg would take on a very symbolic standing in regard to both the civil rights movement and also the counter states' rights movement. So Gettysburg and its various historical contexts are used by political thinkers and advocates of the time to promote one cause or the other. And perhaps this was no more apparent than in July of 1963, when tens of thousands of people gathered to mark the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. And one of the more infamous components of all of this was this very long and drawn-out ceremony, which took place on the steps of the Eternal Peace Light Memorial on Oak Hill. It was pushing 100 degrees. It was blistering hot. You had all of these governors who came to the ceremony, and of course, all of them wanted to give a speech. And so there was just this endless procession of governors delivering speeches in which they were all saying the same thing for the most part. And I've spoken to one or two people who were at this ceremony. They said it just went on and on and on. And people quickly began to lose interest because of the heat. One of the really interesting things about this ceremony, though, as well as others, is some of the people who are in attendance. And among them is the very infamous segregationist governor of Alabama at that time, whose name was George Wallace. And of course, it was just a few weeks earlier where he tried to prevent African American students from gaining entry to the University of Alabama. And he saw the Gettysburg Centennial as a means to further build upon his segregationist platform and resisting federal intervention that would compel him to do otherwise. And so he wrote a number of very interesting letters to the editor, to the Gettysburg Times, where he made the argument that we must resist the forces of regimentation and centralization. And so he was very clear on the point that he was making here at the Gettysburg Centennial. And meanwhile, the governor of New Jersey made a counter argument, saying that, essentially that our democracy is a sham if we cannot protect our citizens and give them the rights and liberties that federal troops here at Gettysburg fought for. And so we see this kind of second battle of Gettysburg, or a sequel battle of Gettysburg, being fought out here within a war of words in 1963. It shouldn't be any surprise to us that many components of this ceremony, as well as other Civil War centennial events that were happening throughout the country, were very much steeped in a lost cause mythology and also a commercialization tied in with all of that. As one journalist said, that the nation treated the Civil War centennial with almost a holiday flair, that it was seen not as a commemoration, but a celebration. And one thing that many Americans wished to celebrate during this time was unity and reconciliation, that we were divided and our country came back together once again. And of course, this was not fully realized in every respect when you consider the widespread segregation in the United States that was happening simultaneous with this. And so the Civil War in the 1960s, just as it is right now in the 2020s, is really at the forefront of national conversation about who we are and where we are going. And so there's all sorts of interesting things that we can learn from that very tumultuous time period as we endure our own tumultuous time period accordingly. A few months later, in November of 1963, November 19th, of course, marked the 100th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. And the main speaker that day was President Eisenhower, who we see here behind the podium. And, it was a very easy thing to get Eisenhower, of course, since he, just lived 2 or 3 miles away from the National Cemetery. But like many politicians, he spoke perhaps a little bit more eloquently about unity of purpose, what the nation represented, what Lincoln's words represented. And, he too hinted at this idea of the unfinished work that Lincoln spoke about a century prior. Over here on the left-hand side of the screen, you also may notice a woman who has a program booklet in her hand. And that is Marian Anderson, who a quarter of a century prior so famously sung on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. after the Daughters of the American Revolution banned her from singing at their venue in Washington. And of course, she was thereafter invited by Eleanor Roosevelt to the Lincoln Memorial. She was the primary singer at this ceremony in November of 1963. And one of the interesting little stories that I found is that there was a mistake in the program booklet, and she was slated to sing the incorrect song. And so somebody ran to nearby St. James Church to get her a hymnal so she could sing the right song. And the parish gave that to her as a token souvenir for her ministry of music that she sang to millions of people over the years. As we get later into the 1960s, we not only see shades of the civil rights movement being expressed on the Gettysburg battlefield, but also issues pertaining to the Vietnam War. And throughout the late 1960s, individuals and groups who were both in favor and opposed to the Vietnam War reflected this in various speeches that they had within the National Military Park. And perhaps one of the most notable of them took place on October 15th, 1969, and there was a national moratorium day to end the war in Vietnam. And hundreds of students and community members marched from Gettysburg College up to Oak Hill. And of course, what better place in Gettysburg to have a peaceful protest than the Peace Light Memorial on that hill. And to the right of the camera's perspective here, there were hundreds of people scattered out on the plains below. And it just goes to show that Gettysburg National Military Park has, and I think always will be, an outdoor forum for citizens to express their grievances and to convey what they believe to be their First Amendment rights. And so that is something of long standing that we see and continue to see within the park. Speaking of peace, this was certainly an idea that President Jimmy Carter had in mind in September of 1978 during the Camp David Accords, just an hour's drive across the Maryland border in the mountains of Western Maryland. And of course, at the Camp David Accords, President Carter was trying to strike a peace deal between the state of Israel, headed by Menachem Begin, as we can see to the left of President Carter, and also Anwar al-Sadat of Egypt, who we can see to the right of President Carter. And the meeting was getting really stuffy and contentious. And Carter decided that he was essentially going to initiate a little field trip for these world leaders and their staff members. And Carter very effectively used the park as a means of showing what war can do, the destruction it can unleash, but also the potentials of peace and reconciliation that can result in the long term. And Park Ranger Bob Prosperi, who we see here giving the tour, really helped to impart a lot of those principles. And I don't want to say that this was the deciding factor that led to the success of the Camp David Accords, but it certainly didn't hurt. That was sure. And ultimately, President Carter will receive the Nobel Peace Prize for striking this deal as a result. So a very interesting moment, once again, in diplomatic history that we see playing out at Gettysburg. And speaking of film cameras and things being widely documented, perhaps the greatest example of this comes about in the summer of 1992, when a film adaptation of Michael Shera's 1972 novel, The Killer Angels, was to be filmed within the park. And this was really the first time that a major film crew had filmed within the borders of these public lands. And I think it's one of the really unique elements of what would become the film Gettysburg that has allowed it to age so well, is that, it wasn't filmed in California, it wasn't filmed overseas. It was filmed on the actual landscape itself by a legion of reenactors who worked for free because they really cared about the story. And I think that passion comes through in a very evocative way for a lot of people when they watch the movie Gettysburg. And the following year, the year after the film comes out, the attendance levels, the visitation levels of the park jumped up by over 100,000. And undoubtedly, that was spurred by a lot of the fascination that was generated by this movie. And I, too, was among that large segment of people who discovered Gettysburg, the place, in the aftermath of Gettysburg, the movie. So that brings us to the second chapter of my book. And this photograph was taken by my late friend Bill Dowling, who was a very gifted battlefield photographer. And this is just one of several of his photographs that grace the pages of my book. And here in the second chapter, we take a more casual look at how and why and where people visit Gettysburg in the first place. And I suspect that a lot of you may recognize the fact that it's not just history that draws people to this place. A lot of people go there to bicycle, to walk, to photograph, to immerse themselves in nature, to take photography, and also to paint, like this gentleman is doing right here. And for a number of years, in partnership with the National Parks Foundation, Gettysburg National Military Park participated in an artist in residence program where artists could live on the battlefield for a few weeks in one of the historic farmhouses. They could go out by day, create their artwork, and then at the end of their term, if you will, they could display that in the park or some other public space within the Gettysburg community. And, it speaks to the many reasons that people go to Gettysburg. It's not just history. That's really the nucleus of why people go there. But it's certainly not the sole reason, and photographs like this certainly remind us of that. One of my favorite things that I see in Gettysburg when I go there, especially every November 19th on Dedication Day, is that every time the anniversary of the Gettysburg Address is commemorated within the Soldiers National Cemetery, there is usually a citizenship program as well, a swearing-in program for immigrants to the United States who have gone through the mountains of red tape to reach that status. And I think it's the most wonderful component of the Dedication Day ceremonies, to watch people be accepted into the folds of American citizenship, and to do so in the same place where Abraham Lincoln spoke about a new birth of freedom, and this being a government of, by, and for the people. The poetry of it just can't be underscored enough, and that's always one of my favorite things to see in Gettysburg, is this annual tribute, if you will. Now, all that said, not everybody who visits Gettysburg National Military Park is open-minded on such issues. And over the past 10 to 12 years in particular, we've seen a renewed resurgence, if you will, of hate groups that likewise use Gettysburg National Military Park as a forum. And, whether you like it or not, as long as these groups go through the proper paperwork and procedures, they are certainly permitted to do this. It's public lands. They are entitled to express their First Amendment rights and to make use of them, and so on and so forth. This photograph that we see here in the background was taken on Juneteenth, a day typically meant to celebrate the end of slavery in a legal sense. And that was a day that the Aryan nations decided to have a very small rally within the park. And of course, this past July, an armed group commandeered the National Cemetery, and it has led to all sorts of discussions about not only the legacies of the Civil War, but how public lands should be used, how the National Park Service and federal agencies should respond to them. What does it mean for the public that is visiting these sorts of lands? And I hope this will not become the case. But after seeing, what has happened in Charlottesville in 2017, more recently at the National Capitol earlier in January, it's in the realm of possibility that Gettysburg could be the site of a Charlottesville 2.0, as issues of Confederate iconography, the Confederate flag, Confederate statues continue to be hotly debated in American society. Gettysburg will always be at the forefront of this discussion, and we can only hope that things go well and peaceful and not continue to accelerate in the way that they have in recent months and years. On a brighter note, one of my favorite interactions that I had when I worked at Gettysburg National Military Park was in 2012 for the dedication day ceremonies. And it just so happened that Steven Spielberg was the keynote speaker for that day. And it was a perfect tie-in with his Abraham Lincoln movie that came out that same week. And it was the biggest crowd that I ever saw for a dedication day ceremony. It doesn't get more famous than Steven Spielberg. And I got to meet with him and talk with him. And I took this photograph of him interacting with the musicians from Gettysburg High School Band. And he gave a phenomenal speech. And he essentially said that he had never been more humbled to speak at a place than in Gettysburg. And I thought that said a lot about his appreciation of the place, considering all the places that he had been to, spoken at, and filmed at throughout the years. And so a very poignant and celebrated and well-attended moment here in park history. Now, as we backtrack just ever so slightly, I think what a lot of these themes allude to is the public's demand for a higher degree of authenticity and a connection to the land itself. And if we were to go back in time about 30 years and look southward down the Emmitsburg Road, this is what we would have seen. And of course, this vista today is dramatically different. These utility lines have been buried underground, and all of them have been undertaken, once again, in the name of authenticity. And so the third chapter of my book looks at a lot of those transformations that have happened in the park over the last 25 years, particularly in regard to what is known as landscape restoration. And there was a very loud kickoff to this process on July 4th, 2000, when the Gettysburg National Tower was finally knocked down. For over a quarter of a century, this structure dominated the Gettysburg skyline, and many preservationists saw it not as the classroom in the sky, as its founder initially anticipated it to be, but rather a monument to money and crass commercialization. And the fact that it looked like the Seattle Space Needle and did not at all fit in within the agrarian environment of South Central Pennsylvania made it a key target for preservationists. And so the National Park Service did something that it doesn't really do that often anymore. is that it used eminent domain. It paid $3 million for the demolition of all of this. And of course, there was a lot of fanfare behind this act, especially the fact that Civil War reenactors operating cannons fired their guns, and the firing of those guns was the signal for the demolition charges to be set on all of this. And to people in the crowd, it looked like the Civil War cannons were knocking down the tower. Definitely, there's some creativity that went into that whole process. But that's really what kicks off landscape restoration. And these two photographs here are ones that I often show my students to illustrate the value of landscape restoration. Because, of course, tearing down trees in a national park seems like an oxymoron. When people think of national parks, you're supposed to be preserving woodlots and trees and growing more of them for the benefit of nature and people's enjoyment. But Gettysburg is not Yosemite. Its mission statement is different. And its mission is to interpret the actions and legacies of both the battle itself and the Gettysburg Address. And I think when you look at these photos, one in the 1990s of the first Minnesota Monument, and then one in the late 2000s of the first Minnesota Monument, for the first time in generations, visitors were able to get a clear understanding of the landscape traversed by that Minnesota regiment during its desperate charge late on July 2nd, 1863. And so I think we need to look no further than these two images to understand the value from a historical and interpretive standpoint of the work that's being undertaken here in this regard. And despite a lot of the successes, there are quite naturally setbacks. And one of the biggest setbacks occurred in February of 2006 when the park suffered some of its worst desecration and vandalism that it had ever undergone before. 3 monuments vandalized, including the ones shown here, the 114th Pennsylvania Regiment along the Emmitsburg Road on the left, and also the 4th New York Artillery Monument located in Devil's Den. And the 114th Pennsylvania was fairly quickly remounted to its perch in front of the Cadore Farm. The issue with the 4th New York Monument, though, was a little bit more tedious and difficult because the head of the monument was stolen. But luckily, park preservationists, after a lot of research and looking into it, were able to relocate an identical statue in Manchester, New Hampshire, and they were able to go and take a mold of that statue and replace the missing head accordingly. And unfortunately, the culprits of this vandalism were never found. The head of the 4th New York Artillery Monument, to my knowledge, is still missing, and I have no doubt that it will probably turn up someday in somebody's garage or yard sale. But in any case, that monument was restored in 2011, and so it was well over a 5-year process to make that happen. At this same time, construction was underway for a new visitor center because the park, which was located in a building, its visitor center located in a building first constructed in the 1930s and then added on to, in addition to the Cyclorama Center, had quickly outgrown its ability to accommodate the throngs of visitors who were coming here. And thus, the National Park Service, in partnership with its nonprofit partner, the Gettysburg Foundation, set out to construct a $110 million facility on the outskirts of core battlefield area that would not only tell the story of the Battle of Gettysburg, it would no longer be just rows of rusty muskets without a story. Rather, it would tell a comprehensive story about the American Civil War, and it would incorporate a sampling of the artifacts in order to tell that story. And I've taken students and gone with students both before and after who have experienced both visitor centers. And I can tell you that the young people they find the new building much, much more engaging and get a lot more out of it than what they did in previous years. And of course, going hand in hand with the landscape restoration, those old visitor centers ultimately came down. And I know that there's a lot of nostalgia, undoubtedly, among some of you who first experienced Gettysburg's history within these buildings. You probably saw the electric map in this building at some point. You saw the Cyclorama painting in its earlier home along Cemetery Ridge. But ultimately, the mission of landscape restoration and returning, a place like Ziegler's Grove to a more 19th century appearance ultimately prevailed. And surprisingly, there were a number of people who were pushing for the preservation of the Cyclorama Center, particularly the family members of Richard Neutra, the architect, the modernist architect who had designed this building as a shrine to Lincoln in the early 1960s. And there were a number of hurdles that had to be taken ultimately for this building to be demolished. But as we can see in this photograph, that is ultimately what happened in March of 2013, just a few months before the Battle of Gettysburg Sesquicentennial. And standing on this spot in July of 2013, amazingly enough, there was scant indication that that building had ever been there. And so it was very, very timely in that regard in acquiring a more bucolic look for that part of the battlefield. And, while a lot of these efforts were being undertaken, there were constantly surprises that sometimes emerged in small ways. And this was particularly so in August of 2011, when a large tree fell down on Culp's Hill after a heavy windstorm. And some of the maintenance crews were sawing away at this witness tree. It had been standing there at the time of the battle. And not once, but twice, the chainsaws struck metal. And lo and behold, they found oxidized mini balls embedded in the tree that had been there for 148 years. Really incredible when you think about it. And so the last chapter of my book focuses on an event that undoubtedly many of you experienced, and that is the Sesquicentennial of the battle. And I was working at the park at this time. It was a high point of my time working there. And there was just an overwhelming sense of camaraderie among all of the people who were present for this and participated in it in one form or another. And if my memory serves correctly, the park was getting something like 50,000 visitors for each of the 5 or 6 days that commemorative activities were ongoing. People started getting into town around June 27th, June 28th. And then on July 1st, it was like the floodgates opened. And park rangers were giving these condensed tours at key spots of the battlefield. And without fail, this is what these crowds looked like. You'd have 500 people showing up every other hour to come listen to a park ranger giving a talk. And I temporarily lost my voice on July 1st and quickly utilized the microphone system that was available to us after that. But these photographs just speak volumes of the experience that park visitors and park staff were having at this time. And this is one of my favorite photographs. I know some friends of the Historical Society, Tim Smith and Gary Edelman, gave a tour to 500 people in which they distributed 3D glasses And a lot of the photographs, Civil War era photographs around the Rose Farm, were analyzed by the masses in 3D. And I love this photograph with two Civil War reenactors with 3D glasses on, because it's something of a time warp. And indeed, I think that's what the anniversary was for a lot of people. And, people were engaged, they were courteous, people were getting along. It was an incredible thing. And, this was, one of the universal emotions being expressed by people who were coordinating this in one form or another. And then the high point of all of this was a recreation of Pickets Charge on July 3rd, 2013. And naturally, reenactments are not allowed in national parks. You cannot have two opposing lines of people shooting at each other. But ultimately, what park administrators determined would be best, rather than having reenactors march across and having people just watch them, why not have something that was a little bit more participatory? Allow the people themselves to walk. Have them be participants rather than passive observers. And going into all of this, the park staff really didn't know how many people to expect. We didn't know if there were going to be 3,000 people or 10,000 people. And ultimately, it was determined that about 15 to 16,000 people participated, with perhaps another 40,000 people watching it from Cemetery Ridge. And so there were more people involved in this 2013 recreation of Pickets Charge than what there actually was involved in 1863. And then it was just a sight to behold, all those people gathered there on that space at that time. And one of the fun things about this photo is that I was able to find myself, and you can see me there wearing my park ranger top hat amidst all of the flags and people. And so, like I said, that was a very memorable and colorful and lively event from my years working at the park. About 2 months later, another commemorative exercise took place, and that was the annual convention of the National Congressional Medal of Honor Society, which chose Gettysburg as its meeting location that September. And the superintendent at the time, Bob Kirby, to a bit of controversy, lifted the longstanding ban of fireworks to be held in the national park. Fireworks are not typically something that is held at Gettysburg National Military Park, although it was permitted here. But I was able to snap this really stellar photograph as a result, with the Pennsylvania Monument being illuminated in the foreground. And the interesting epilogue to this convention gathering was the fact that just a few months later, the Battle of Gettysburg obtained its 64th Medal of Honor recipient in the form of Lieutenant Alonzo Cushing, who lost his life in helping to repulse Pickets Charge. And, there was some criticism of this as well in historian circles. Some historians were concerned that this would start a precedent of, just handing out the Medal of Honor and, perhaps trivializing it, long after the fact. I guess I took a somewhat contrary approach to that. What better to speak to the relevance of the Civil War than granting the nation's highest honor to a soldier who fell in that war a century and a half after the fact? I think it adds public interest and fascination and a level of importance to the American Civil War all of these years later. I may be wrong, but that's just my outlook on it. And as we look to the future, one of the big questions is, how are you going to get young people engaged? When I was growing up, there are a lot of Civil War movies and television shows, and for people who are now in their late 20s and early and mid 30s, that was the spark for them. That's what got them engaged. But of course now, there aren't really any Civil War movies. There's no television shows. The Civil War in some circles has become a somewhat toxic thing to study, just because of the volatility and ramifications of it that continue to play out. And ultimately, the route that the National Park Service as a whole is trying to take is, really the best way to get young people engaged in these stories is to have them visit these places themselves. And it really speaks to the power of place. And the week after the Medal of Honor convention at Gettysburg, the park was inundated with 5,000 Boy Scouts who were camping out and being involved in various public works projects, if you will. And that's when this photograph here was taken. And so it was a very busy month for Gettysburg National Military Park, and I can attest to that personally. But as we ponder, how do you get young people engaged? Movies help, TV shows help, but taking them there in person, allowing them to connect with it in their own way, I think is a really pivotal form of engagement that should not be overlooked. And, as we ponder kind of where we stand as a nation, especially, in 2015, after the Charleston church shooting, that's when a lot of examination and reflection about Confederate imagery really came up in discussion. I think that conversation has only accelerated in the 5 or so years since. And, also to a degree of public scrutiny, the park removes select pieces of Confederate merchandise from its gift shop in the aftermath of all of that. And, ultimately, the argument is increasingly being made is that, the best place for the Confederate flag is in museums like the one we see here, where context can be added to it, where it's presented and surrounded by the facts of history. And so I don't have a clear-cut answer for, all of these dilemmas and issues and questions. But, it's kind of where we're heading as a nation, whether you agree with it or not. That's really what we see going on within the broader realm of historical study and remembrances of the Confederacy. But all in all, I think we can call back on the words of President Lincoln, and that idea of for the people. It comes not only to represent the ideals of the nation itself and the reasons for which these federal soldiers whose tombstones we see here perished, but it also comes to represent the national park ideal itself. That these are lands for the people to be enjoyed so they can learn from them. They can make connections with nature and history, and hopefully they can learn something from that and become better and more engaged citizens as a result. And I think that is one of the great things that we can recall and bear in mind when we think about places like Gettysburg National Military Park. Thank you for having me speak to the Society this evening.
Thank you, Jared, for that session, for giving us new perspectives on the Gettysburg battlefield. We look forward to seeing you again and hope you will return to be a speaker with the Adams County Historical Society. If any of you in our audience are interested in Jared's books, his artwork, his videos, they are available on his website, which is jaredfrederick.com. The books I know you can also find on Amazon if you prefer that. So thank you all very much for being in our audience, and thank you for supporting the Adams County Historical Society.